Kids, celebrating Black History Month is a good thing for reminding us of where we've come from. This is a really good story about Henry's Freedom Box by Ellen Levine. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Imagine that, not being allowed to know your birthday. Henry and his mother and his sisters and his brother worked in a big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from the leaves, from the trees, like slave children are torn from their families. One morning the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set them free. But the master said, "You are a good worker. Henry, I am giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he did not say thank you. That would have been a lie. So that's what they did sometimes with slaves. They just would give them away to other families to keep working. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. A free bird, a happy bird, Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family, and they looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind. So they were all saying goodbye to each other, to work in factories. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. Henry's growing up. "Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy. He poked the boy with the stick. If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you. Hard times. Henry was lonely, and one day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and they talked and they agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he decided to hum. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, and then another and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had a great deal of money. "I'm afraid they will sell our children," he said. Henry sat very still. Henry worked all morning and he tried to forget what Nancy had said. His friend James came to the factory and whispered to Henry, "Your wife and your children were just sold in the slave market." "No!" cried Henry. Henry couldn't move, he couldn't think, and he couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco," the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted the tobacco leaves. His heart twisted in his chest. His family was just sold. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of the town. A large group of slaves were tied together, and the owner shouted at them, Henry looked for his family. "Father! Father!" Henry watched his children, disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her the same moment she saw him. When he wiped away his tears, Nancy too was gone. So their family was sold. Henry no longer sang, and he couldn't hum, he couldn't work, and at night he ate supper and he went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everyone that he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. That happened. A lot of families were separated and they never saw each other again. Many weeks passed, and one morning Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of the tree on the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. But how? He lifted a crate, and he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. Then they met early the next day in an empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to a place where there is no slaves," he said. James stared at the box and then at Henry. "What if you cough? What if someone hears you?" "I will cover my mouth and hope," Henry said. Well, Dr. Smith wrote on the box, "To William H. Johnson, and Ark Street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia." Then he printed on the crate with big letters, "This side up." He's going to mail himself in a box. But Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think that he had ran off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. He opened a bottle of oil of vitriol. "No!" cried James. Henry poured it on his hand, and it burned his skin to the bone. And now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand, and they arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. The sun was not up yet when Henry climbed into the box. "Ready?" he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station, and the railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a piece of paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box into the luggage car. They don't know he's in there. Look at that. He's inside this box. Amazing, isn't it? Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves splashing. This must be the steamboat headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst, but he was afraid to move, for someone might hear him. They would send him back, and he would be in bigger trouble. "I'm tired of standing," someone said. "Well, why don't we move the box and sit on it?" said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Look at that. He's stuck inside. This is what it looked like. Not a lot of room. Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck. Now he was on his right side, and now he's on his left, and suddenly he was right side up. Thank goodness. "What do you think is in here?" said the first man. "Mail, I guess," said the other. "Aye," and mail, thought Henry, but not the kind of mail they imagine. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed into a railroad car, this time heads up. He fell asleep to the rattling song of the train wheels. It's almost there to freedom. He awoke to a loud knocking. Henry, are you all right in there? All right, he answered. The cover was pried open and Henry stretched and stood up, and 4 men smiling at him. Welcome to Philadelphia. Boys and girls, he was probably in there for like 2 weeks, sitting in a box. At last, Henry had a birthday. March 30th, 1849, his first day of freedom. And from that day on, he also had a middle name, and everyone called him Henry Box Brown. Good story. Henry Box Brown was one of the Underground Railroad's most famous runaway slaves, and he had the most ingenuitive ideas. So celebrate freedom today. Celebrate freedom every day. You guys have a good day.